Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar on introducing the Getting to Know Pacific Island students from the Freely Associated States Infographic series. I'm Kirsten Miller. I'm a communications manager at REL Pacific, and I'll be one of your facilitators today. I am joined by my colleagues Kanoa Ishihara, who will be our tech facilitator, and Darian Day, Natasha Sailua, and Megan Taylor, whom I'll introduce in a little more detail shortly. So we're asking everyone to stay muted to avoid background noise and any feedback, but you can use the chat feature to ask questions, and we'll address those during our question and answer session. So far we have a small group, others may join, so we may be able to open up for a more interactive discussion a little bit later. But when you post in the chat, please do make sure to send to all panelists and attendees, and that'll allow others to see your questions and comments and to keep that chat more interactive. So for technical questions, please reach out to Kanoa in the chat. And we are recording the session, and we'll share the recording of slides from you along with the survey. So go ahead and look for a follow-up email from us shortly. Kanoa, could we go actually to the next slide after that? So I'm going to just briefly tell you a little bit about REL Pacific and our work in case you're not yet familiar with us. We are one of 10 regional educational laboratories, or RELs, that are funded by the Institute of Education Sciences, or IES. So on this slide, this map illustrates all 10 of those regions, so it doesn't show our entire region. And on the next slide, we'll provide some information about the REL Pacific region. So we serve educators in the state of Hawaii in 3 U.S. territories, including American Samoa, Guam, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and then 3 independent nations in free association with the U.S. And that includes the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, including Kosrae, Pohnpei, Chuuk, and Yap, and the Republic of Palau. And within these jurisdictions, we work with a number of research practice partnerships, and those focus on several distinct priority areas, which I'll just briefly describe. College and career readiness and success, and that's really about aligning system expectations for K-12 graduates with entry into college and the workforce. And then professional learning, which is about collaborating with teachers, system leaders, and other educators to create a professional learning environment in which teacher development is not only welcomed, but really works. And then language and literacy, which is about developing language skills and literacy goals in multilingual contexts, primarily in the lower grades. Social and emotional learning, how we can use social and emotional competencies and supports to improve student outcomes. And then data use and readiness, which really focuses on increased institutional data use to improve, again, system and student outcomes. On our next slide, we'll just go over our objectives briefly. So during our time together today, we're going to learn about the Getting to Know Pacific Island students from the Freely Associated States Infographic series. And we'll talk a little about the culturally informed process that we use to create each infographic. We'll talk about each individual infographic in turn and the knowledge base that they draw upon. And then we'll learn how the series can support teachers who may be unfamiliar with freely associated states students or cultures. And finally, we'll discuss how to access and distribute the infographics to stakeholders. So on our next slide, you'll see our agenda for the day. First up is Darian Day, my colleague who's a research associate at REL Pacific, and she'll be talking, she'll provide an introduction to the freely associated states. Then after that, Natasha Sailua, a researcher at REL Pacific, will introduce the infographic series. And then finally, Megan Taylor, a managing consultant, will talk about how you can use the infographic series. And then after that, we'll have a question and answer session. But again, please do feel free to add those questions in the chat as they come up. And so with that, I will turn it over to Darian for the next part of our presentation.
Mahalo, Kirsten. Elina Mai, everyone. My name is Darian, and I'll be providing a brief introduction to the Freely Associated States. So the Freely Associated States, or FAS as we'll commonly be referring to them throughout this presentation, consists of 3 countries that Kirsten mentioned that have international agreements with the United States called the Compacts of Free Association, or COFA. And that's the Republic of Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, or FSM, and then the Republic of the Marshall Islands, or RMI. So in exchange for maintaining its military presence in these nations, the United States provides certain benefits to FAS governments and their citizens. The FAS governments have access to funding for public education systems such as Pell Grants, and then the U.S. Postal Service, the Federal Aviation Administration, and then the Federal Emergency Management Agency. while FAS citizens can freely travel, live, work, and study in the United States and in each other's nations. So following World War II, FSM, Palau, and RMI were designated as the United Nations Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, and these were administered by the United States from 1947 to 1994. With the COFA agreements with FSM and RMI in 1986 and with Palau in 1994, this allowed the United States to negotiate land usage for military bases and operate armed forces in these nations, while reciprocating with the benefits, the aforementioned benefits to FAS governments and citizens. COFA funding is set to expire in 2023 for Palau and in 2024 for FSM and RMI, but with the option to renegotiate. And so these negotiations will probably focus on issues of human rights, migration, economic assistance, and of course, defense relations. So citizens of FAS have migrated between US territories and states and FAS for reasons related to education, jobs, health, and family. From about 2009 to 2018, the number of FAS migrants living in the US states and territories rose by about 68%, from about 56,000 to about 94,000. Approximately 49% of FAS migrants lived in another jurisdiction served by REL Pacific, but outside of these states. So 26% lived in Hawaii, 20% lived in Guam, and 3% lived in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, or CNMI. However, an estimated 50% of FAS migrants lived within the continental US, with the largest numbers in the states of Washington, Oregon, California, all along the West Coast, and then Arkansas more centrally. With global climate change and other factors pressuring FAS citizens, this trend of migration might continue, but has already resulted in large populations of students in students with FAS familial ties attending schools outside of their original nations. And with that, we'll move on to the next section.
Thank you so much, Darian. Talofa, my name is Natasha. I'm very grateful you've joined us on today's webinar. I'll be doing an introduction of the infographic series, and then we'll take a closer look at each individual infographic. So as Darian mentioned, that important context, families have moved from the FAS to pursue education, work, and healthcare in the continental US, in the West Coast, and increasingly in Arkansas, Oklahoma, and other states in the Midwest and South. There was a GAO report that was released last year that provides a lot of details about this migration. Growing populations of the Pacific Island students in US schools have prompted a need for a closer look at the ways in which educators can provide culturally relevant, responsive, and sustaining education to students who are from the Pacific region or have family connections in the Pacific region. So the overarching goal of this infographic series was to promote more awareness, more understanding, and appreciation of the diversity of cultures and experiences of Pacific Islanders, and also to provide some methods, tips, ideas for educators to meaningfully engage with Pacific students and their communities inside and outside of the classroom. So next, I'll give you an introduction of the infographic series. You can navigate to this website to access the infographics. One of my co-presenters will share the link in the comments. And actually, I'll try to do so in just a little bit. In the next slide, I offer just a little bit of the process that we took in creating the infographics. And we relied on primarily these elements. We spoke with and held sort of informational interviews with community leaders and locally based consultants, both in the islands and also in the United States. We have a very rigorous cultural quality assurance process with stakeholders in the Pacific region, and we asked them to evaluate these 4 features of our infographics. Each one we asked them, does the infographic use plain jargon-free language? Is the representation or portrayal of Pacific cultures, is that respectful? Are there, what are the use of cultural references to strengthen connections to concepts? And finally, most importantly to me personally too, presentation of content from an asset-based rather than a deficit-based perspective. And finally, as if you have a chance to be looking at the infographics right now, and we'll take a look more closely, you'll notice the visual representation and the art. We engaged an artist from the FAS who, who knew her community and knew about the ways to respectfully portray FAS cultures and peoples. So let's turn to infographic 1. I'll go over these in order. So first up, we have this one, which addresses the question, what are the freely associated states? On the first page of this infographic, we have introductory information about the Compacts of Free Association, or COFA, which, as Darian mentioned, is a set of agreements between these 3 island nations, the Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau, that are held with the United States. So as such, they're said to be in free association. The map in the middle of this depicts the travel between the US and the nations, and which we characterize as a cycle, because as we've heard and talked with our community members, families regularly travel to and from these islands. So it's not sort of a one-way or unidirectional travel. On pages 2 and 3, we provide a map of these 3 states and some demographic information about each one. And other facts such as immigration status and factors that bring FAS students, FAS citizens to the United States. I just want to pause really quick and just sort of say, when we were sort of taking a look at these, notice, if you will, the color, the arrangement of the graphics and the art. This is something that we were endlessly caught up on and just loved to look at the little details of the people and the places. So this last page, and something that's characteristic of all the infographics, we offer some thoughts about how this information may inform culturally responsive education. Some points for consideration. So, for example, how teachers can use this information to inform their instructional activities, or school leaders can think about some school events. So moving to the next infographic, that one asks the question, why do student names matter? On the first page of this infographic, we provide the context and the foundation for understanding why this topic is so important, and depict some educational scenarios where the topic of student names might come up. Now, you may or may not have some experience in working with FAS communities. Names can be so important. They can carry a student's their background, their genealogy. There's so many different reasons, and we wanted to make sure that this infographic provided a lot of information about this topic to teachers and educators. On the second page, to the left, we provide a range of topics and scenarios where understanding some of the naming conventions might be important for educators. And this is just, it's just sort of a way to go in at least a little bit more detail into topics that I know there are likely books about, right? To the right, you can see a map of the region where we offer a few distinguishing characteristics between Palau, FSM, and the Marshall Islands. And on the bottom of that page, we've provided translations for how to ask students, what's your name, in some of the national and state languages. Finally, page 4 of this infographic provides suggestions for how educators can practice culturally responsive education, both in the classroom and at the school or district level. It's a little small to read, so I'm gonna try to, there's some activities that you can design, some just even topics that you can bring up with parents or families, to increase engagement. So I urge you to take a look at some of those examples. The third infographic in this series is titled, What is School Like? So this infographic provides information about schooling context in the FAS for those who have never been there and serve students who are newly arrived. So the first page of this infographic provides a quick overview for some of those salient characteristics. We loved talking with some of the educators about, for some of the students, going to school isn't like, traveling from point A to point B within, a school that's down your street or within, it may involve traversing over water. It may involve having to navigate some weatheriness. So, and I also, just looking at some of the different school systems that are available, and the context, the historical political context of some of those school systems. On the bottom half of this page, we also, no, sorry. So going to the next slide, page 2 on your left, that sort of showcases a day in the life, so to speak, of an FAS student. For example, the example I provided, well, some students take a bus to school, others may travel on a boat, and some of these other, some that are familiar and some that are very unique to the islands. And then page 3 of this infographic provides more specific details about schools and students in each of the 3 nations. And we envision educators using these data to spark dialogue with students or their families or community members about what it might look like for them, especially if they have some awareness of having gone to school in the islands and are now living in the US. We provide some reflection questions at the top of the page to stimulate folks thinking about those topics. Finally, page 4 of this infographic provides suggestions for how educators can implement some of these strategies or implement some of this information in the classroom and in school district-wide. And hopefully you're able to take a look at that on your screen, because I know it is a little tiny for it to read. So up until this point, the first 3 infographics that I've mentioned are immediately available for download on the website. This next one that we're going to discuss, and the 5th one, especially this 4th one, is expected to go live any day now. If you look at the next slide, we're going to the infographic 4, why do students' languages matter? This infographic focuses on the complexity of language for students from the FAS and how that manifests in their educational experiences. Language is such a dominant feature of students' lives, all students, right? And scholars from a wide range of disciplines have mapped how language shapes a person's cultural and social identity. So in this infographic, again, we're not able to dive as deep as I think this topic deserves, all the topics deserve. But we share some information about the language backgrounds of students from the FAS and how that may impact their experiences in education, especially if they're moving from the islands to the US. On page 2 of this infographic, we offer some scenarios depicting some of their language experiences. What I love about these scenarios is that it's far more complex than simply, I think what an education scholarship might think about as like English language learner context. I think it's just really reimagining what we know about language and students and how that influences their identity, how they show up in the classroom, right? On page 3, we showcase, this was a big one, is we showcase the language diversity within the US, and you can sort of just see at a glance the list of languages that might be relevant to students. The last page of this infographic, again, some suggestions for educators. I think some of the low-hanging fruit of the series is providing translation and interpretation, but there's like a lot of other things that you can do, and we can go over those in more detail if you like. I know that this one is not yet available publicly, so we are talking about it, and hopefully eventually you'll be able to take a look at it.
Tasha, I'm just going to jump in. Actually, it's not yet embedded on the REL Pacific site, but I just checked and it is now on the IES site. So I shared that link in the chat.
Oh, awesome. Yay. That's exciting. I've been refreshing that page. So yeah, every single day.
It may just have come up just this morning. So, but that is live now on the IES site.
Awesome. That's good to know. Thanks, Kirsten. Finally, we have our 5th infographic. This one is titled Using Data to Inform Practice. So the first page of this infographic in general is sort of a capstone for the infographic series. And we're really shifting sort of the dialogue towards, teachers having to use data to to provide, high quality instruction, to support their students, to inform the environments that they provide. So the first page of this infographic is where we're sort of just introducing the topic, and we wanted to make sure that educators understood, the lens with which we would like to, having seen all of the different information about about FAS students, how might this inform your data practices? So on page 2 and 3, page 2, we have some resources for data use, especially with a focus on some of the resources, the REL, the regional educational laboratories. And what we've done with this infographic series too is we're thinking about folks who might pick it up if you happen to print it out, or you see a printout at your school district office, and you want to sort of see immediately some of these resources. We have the QR code. If you're viewing it as a PDF, there will be embedded links for which will take you to the IES site and to explore each of these different resources. On page 3, we're looking, we go a little bit more into some of the resources available to inform your perspectives on data use. And we feature this forum guide on data ethics. We think that there's a lot of important information around it's sort of like informing, what you think about when you think about data, how you think about students' data. And so the data ethics guide is really looking at integrity, data security, data quality and security of data. Towards the bottom of that page, we have a map of the region again, and the example of how students self-identify and how that might influence the data quality. As an example, if a student, is filling out their registration form and they may look at certain categories and not see themselves represented in the data, what does that mean for the quality of your data, the data that you're able to collect on students? Just as one example. I know that there are several other examples, and other folks on the webinar can speak more to those. Finally, page 4 of this infographic, we provide a recap of the first 4 infographics. We have the QR codes, and sort of looking at this like from a data use from a cultural context. So if your school serves diverse students, or if your school specifically, if you serve FAS students, and you would like to see some of the resources that our REL has provided, we have some of those, and we have 3 of those featured here. I'll pause really quickly and say that the QR code at the bottom of each infographic on the last page, that will take you to the landing page of the link that we shared earlier. And that's static for each of the infographics. And yeah, this one we hope will come out soon. I will ask Kirsten may know more about that, but yeah, we can't wait for you all to take a look at this last one. So now I will turn it over to Megan. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Tasha, and aloha, everyone. My name is Megan Taylor, and I'm excited to be here today with you. I get this opportunity to talk to everyone a little bit more about how we hope and we envision that you and educators and community leaders can use these infographics to support what's happening in the classroom. And I want to start out just talking a little bit about myself and my background. As a child growing up here in Hawaii, I went to a private school and went to school with students that had very similar cultural backgrounds as mine, very similar cultural practices. And I had no idea that there were things happening in schools and in families and in culture sort of beyond this little island. And when I first started teaching, I taught in a school that was a very, very different demographic than the one that I grew up in. I had no idea that students moved during the year. Certainly, I had no idea that students moved in and out of schools numerous times during the year. And it wasn't necessarily about Title I or that kind of different demographic, but just different students, different cultural practices, different expectations about parent involvement and those kinds of things. And it meant that when I started teaching, I really was not aware of best practices that would support all of my students. I used a lot of strategies that helped many of my students and helped me really connect to many of them. But I wasn't really supporting all of my students. And fast forward a couple of years, I had the opportunity to get ESL endorsed and to become a teacher of the ESL endorsement, and was just amazed to find all these skills and strategies and ideas that really supported my ability to work with all students, but really target students from different demographics and different backgrounds to know how to really help support their learning. Of course, not every teacher has this opportunity, not every teacher has this background. And so as we created these infographics, we recognized that in many of the places these students are moving, this will be the first time teachers have an opportunity to work with them. And we worry that broad generalizations about strategies might not always be the best to support their learning. And so while good teaching is good teaching for all students everywhere, we hoped that these infographics would fill a need for information on how educators can support FAS students. And of course, as Tasha shared, while every page of the infographic offers a lot of information, the final page of each infographic is really focused on application ideas for teachers, school leaders, and community leaders. So as we talk about teachers, these are the people who most directly support students in their learning. We really thought specifically about what are strategies, ideas for them as they plan and prepare and teach these students. And so you can see some of the ways that these infographics will help teachers give them sort of an understanding of contextual information about FAS students, which really helps us understand then how to support them. Give ideas about how they can create a welcoming environment to families or these students. Provide materials for conversations as they connect with parents and guardians, inform the creation of culturally relevant, sustaining instructional strategies, and support students in their learning. And again, I'm going to move to telling a bit of a story. As I fast forward a little bit to, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 years into my career, and I started doing Friday morning reading with families. And so Friday mornings when parents brought their kids to school, instead of just dropping them off and leaving, my parents could come into my classroom and they could stay. And they spent the first half an hour of the day reading with their own student or reading with other students in the classroom. And while that was really wonderful that they were in my classroom and reading with their student, the thing that time actually did was open up opportunities for conversations with the parents and me. So during that time, I'd have the parents come up and they'd say, my student was working on this and I noticed that they were struggling, or I don't understand how you're doing the math on this, or can you tell me how my student is doing in school, or can you talk to me about how to help my students more? Now, culturally, that was not something that most of the parents I worked with had done in the past. But just by consistently opening up my classroom, these parents started to open up and we could do a better job as a team supporting the students that I was teaching. I also ended up that year having 100% parent involvement, attendance at parent-teacher conferences, which our school's average was about 20% generally. And so it's strategies like this, strategies that we hope are not terribly time-intensive, strategies that we hope are not huge for teachers to implement, but ones that we really think will be able to quickly impact the way that teachers are able to work with and support students in their learning. The next group that we really focused on were our school leaders. We know that as school leaders, they create the culture for the school by saying, this is what we deem as important. This is what we're going to put time and money and resources and people behind. And so we offer insight in each of the infographics to school leaders about ways that they can consider supporting the FAS students in their schools. Some of the ideas we offered, we hope that school leaders might take some of the ideas and strategies and background and perhaps use them to inform professional development or professional learning activities for teachers. We hope that possibly they'll consider updating student information or systems so that they can be more accurate. You'll see a lot of examples in these infographics about how people sort of make vast generalizations about students coming from the FAS, and how possibly thinking about these systems or ways that students are able to share information will help teachers do a better job at supporting their different students. And then, of course, we hope that the information in the infographic will help school leaders do a better job at being able to inform and support those partnerships between school and parents and the community. We know that it is all of these things that support and improve student learning. And so we hope that with these different ideas, it gives that partnership a boost, and school leaders some ideas about how to really improve that. And then, of course, finally, we have the community leaders. Again, we know that all of these pieces play into supporting students. So some of the ideas that we offer for community leaders to support students as they move into their schools or into their communities. First of all, as Tasha said, we offer a lot of contextual information when discussing needs and supports of students moving in. So that community leaders might know, well, these are things that might be popular for these students. I think a really, really good example, one of the infographics we talk about was, I just blanked. Oh, was sports in high school, and how organized sports, when kids coming from the FAS might say they played basketball or something, that what people maybe on the mainland have as they think about that might be a different context than what these students mean by that. And so sort of understanding that context and the differences so that community leaders can ask questions and actually provide opportunities and resources to these students that actually meet them where they are. Of course, we hope that the information informs conversations with teachers and school leaders about what culturally relevant education looks like. This is so, so important to us as we have these conversations and created these to discuss what does a culturally relevant education look like and how does it support students? And then, of course, again, to generate dialogue between community members, between school members, for the significance of what migration might mean to students or families, for the different contexts and for application and those kind of things. So as you share and use these infographics, that's how we really thought of these being useful and implemented into different schools or different communities. And we really hope that you see that as you look through these, that as you start to use them, you start to see, oh, this is a really good idea for, you know, maybe a parent night, or this is a great idea for how to start a new extracurricular activity in the community, or those kinds of things. We really hope that the information provides some ideas for really how to support these students in all different spheres. So that is the end of the conversation about how to implement. And I'm going to turn this section over then back to Kirsten, who's going to take your questions, and we hope to be able to answer them.
Thank you so much, Megan, Darian, and Tasha, for all of your presentations. So since we have plenty of time for questions and answers, and since we have a small group, I think we could go either way. We could ask you to put your questions in the chat if you're more comfortable, or if you'd like to unmute yourself and go ahead and verbally ask the question, we can do that also. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and put our survey link in the chat as well. It's just something that we ask you to do. It's very brief, just a few questions to let us know what you thought about the content today. and some open-ended questions to help us learn how to improve or to let us know what you'd like to see more of. So I'm going to link that as everyone kind of thinks about any questions that they may have, and then we'll go ahead and open it up. As people think about questions, as I was listening to the presentations, yeah, I was really struck by that last page of each infographic being around culturally responsive strategies, and around the fact that these are so targeted for freely associated state students. But I did wonder if potentially any of these strategies or any of this information has broader use for different student populations.
That's a great question, Kirsten. And I personally, I think so. And I think that's something that we tried to think about as we were drafting the content. Something Megan said earlier, good teaching is good teaching. And I think part of culturally responsive, culturally sustaining education is that the flexibility to sort of look back on the things that you've been able to do, sort of evaluate how or to what extent those has been supporting students. And I think that's a lot of these things, we're targeting students from the FAS, but really could be dialed back and then sort of rethought about to support many other students. The example that comes to mind is recognizing some of the popular holidays in the FAS. Manat Day just recently passed. It was earlier last month, and that's a popular Marshallese holiday. And I know that some of the schools here in the Hawaii Department of Education, supported students celebrating, encouraged students to wear their, sort of their Marshallese Pride Day. That was something that happened at my daughter's high school. So just as like simple things like that, I can certainly imagine that being something important or special for students from American Samoa in recognizing Flag Day in April, just other Pacific contexts, or any student coming from a culture, sharing culture, a cultural background that where their culture is sort of respected, acknowledged, celebrated, and that's seen as something an asset that they bring to school, and not something where they have to sort of conform or learn differently. So that's a start to an answer. I don't know if others have additional thoughts to this.
Of course, I have additional thoughts. And I agree with Tasha and just want to build on it. I think, like Tasha said, good teaching is good teaching. And there are strategies that will work with students that come from different backgrounds that are good for all students. We know that things like collaboration or small group opportunities to talk before sharing out with a class, or getting all students to find ways to answer. The way you ask a question that engages every student in having to think about the answer before you just call in one student. These are all strategies that are going to help all students learn and engage, and also support even more students that might come from these backgrounds. But there are some of these that I worry about, sort of, again, the overgeneralization of saying, oh, well, if that works for, then it works for all. And I think what these provide is a way to say, oh, okay, this is a great strategy, but it's important to know that perhaps culturally, the dynamic of hierarchy might play a role in how students engage in those conversations, or how parents would engage with me in those conversations. And so being able to put some of that cultural context added to these strategies helps to make it culturally relevant, a culturally relevant strategy. And I think that just makes it stronger. So that's what I would add.
Also, it occurs to me listening to you, Tasha and Megan, that another sort of value add from our infographic series is that it really could be used as a template for educators who are working with different populations of students. So, take a look at that and think about names, for example. Is that, are there things you need to know about names for other populations of students, or about what school is like for other populations of students, or languages? And so that could provide a bit of a launching point for their own sort of exploration of how to best serve different student populations, without using, as Megan cautioned, without overgeneralizing these particular strategies and this information. So we have a comment from Roberta. Good ideas to use in staff development for places like Guam, where we have a mixture of students. And I think that's definitely our hope, is that it will be shared widely within those environments. And then we have a question. I would love to hear more about the process of working with stakeholders in the region to gather information featured in the infographics, like school experiences, language backgrounds, etc.
Thanks for that question. This is such a fascinating conversation for me. I think, because what was so difficult was, how specific to be, because we know that there are so many different variations to how students experience their own cultures and their own language backgrounds. And we were able to, I will say at a first level, REL Pacific works with our locally based consultants. So we worked a lot with our locally based consultants to gather information. We held informational interviews, talk story really. We sort of said, this is what we hope this infographic will be about. Can we ask you about some of these? And, sort of little by little, we would gather information. We also definitely relied on the literature base around those topics there. And we tried to, as much as possible, for each infographic. Each infographic has a landing page where we link some of those resources to. Our LBCs, our locally based consultants, also connected us to some folks, some stakeholders in the region that might have more knowledge to share about these topics. And we worked with folks not just in the FAS, but also education folks. For example, one of our liaisons works in Arkansas with one of the school districts, and she's a community liaison. So having grown up in FAS and then moved with her family to Arkansas and works with educators now to develop their teaching and supporting the FAS population there, which was really fascinating, I think, because the end result, which is an infographic, is something that she can actually take to her school district or to teachers and say, now, so here's some of the questions that you've been asking me. Here's actually a resource we could provide. I think another interesting thing, one other thing I'll say is during the interviews, one comment that came up was this could also be useful for teachers who are recruited to teach in the FAS who may not be from the region themselves, so who may also need some of that contextual information for their own work once they're moving out there. And that's all I'll say about that.
Thank you, Tasha. And then Katie has shared a question for webinar participants. It's a great question, and would be really useful to hear your perspectives on that. So do you, as participants, have suggestions for school districts, government departments, higher education departments, et cetera, that we could reach out to with these infographics to ensure that, that we get them into the right hands for stakeholders who might find them useful? We would love to hear any participant perspectives on that. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and reshare the survey link. So Roberta said she's sharing with principals of different schools and with students in the teacher ed classes and the professors at UOG. That's very helpful. Other suggestions? All of you should have my email. You should have Kanoa's email if you have additional suggestions, questions. We will also send a follow-up either later today or first thing tomorrow with the slide deck and with the survey link, and then with links to all of the resources that we've shared today. It might be good to send out access to these with a suggestion for staff development discussions. That's a great idea, Roberta. We can certainly also send out, we can share via Twitter, we can share via news blasts, and more targeted, do a more targeted share to some of our stakeholders and suggest that they're used for staff development discussions. That's a great suggestion. We have that QR code also, if you'd like to take a quick screenshot of that on that next slide. And again, we'll share all these resources in our follow-up email. And we do expect that 5th infographic to be available soon. We'll share that as well. And once this recording is available, we will also send that along so that you can share that with any colleagues who were not able to make it today. I think we can close and let everyone go, but again, please do not hesitate to reach out if you have any additional questions. Thank you so much for joining us.